Thanks so much, Annie. Good afternoon, beloveds. Thank you so much for joining us for this exciting panel discussion about transforming our faith communities on climate. My name is Taina Diaz-Reyes, and I'm the Hunger Advocacy Fellow from the ELCA Advocacy Office in Washington, D.C. I'm thrilled to be here with you today, joined by three powerful women who are transforming communities on climate change and rooted in their spiritual teachings. In just a moment, we'll hear the stories of navigating uncertainty, economic challenges, partisanship, environmental racism, and systemic injustice in order to move local congregations, communities, and beyond from inaction to action. While each story is different, I encourage you to listen and consider ways your own communities are reflected and called into action, and consider your own transformative role to play. My hope is that their experience and wisdom will empower us with their stories as we answer our own call to ambitious climate action. We'll hear from each speaker first, then open the discussion for Q&A. So, without further ado, let me introduce our prophetic speakers now. Their full bios are being chatted out in the Action Center. First, we introduce the Reverend Dr. Heather McColl, who joins us as pastor of Midway Christian Church in Midway, Kentucky. Serving the church since 2006, Pastor McColl leads the congregation in their belief that spiritual development is linked with caring for God's creation and being good stewards of the earth. Midway Christian Church is a model in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ Green Chalice program and featured in Eco America's Let's Lead on Climate Guide. Second, we welcome Kandi White, Native Energy and Climate Campaign Coordinator and Leadership Team member of Indigenous Environmental Network. She represents the Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara communities. Kandi is a leading voice in the fight to bring visibility to the impacts of climate and environmental justice on Indigenous communities across North America. Her local work is complemented by international advocacy work, including participation in several United Nations forums and testimony before the U.S. Congress on climate and its links to health, identity, and well-being on tribal lands. Finally, we are joined by the Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, who is just recently appointed to be the new Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Spaces for the City of Boston. Congratulations, and is the founding pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester, Massachusetts. Reverend Mariama is a renowned local and national advocate for ecological and social justice, youth engagement, and spirit-filled organizing. She was selected as one of the Grist 50 Fixers of 2019 and Sojourner's 11 Women Shaping the Church. So let's get started by hearing from Reverend McColl. First, have her share with us her story of transformation.
It is an honor to be with y'all, everyone, today, and I am humbled to be in the presence of such amazing people because I have to admit, Midway Christian Church started our journey with Going Green as a small congregation for the basic fact of trying to save green. When you're a small congregation, ways to save money are key because that continues your programs. And so we kind of started looking at that of changing the light bulbs from fluorescents to LEDs. And then it sort of became a game of how do you do it and what can we do? But our commitment has evolved over the years as we studied more theologically and spiritually of why we do what we do. As disciples of Christ, we are people of the table. And realized in our connection to the table, we are connected to everything. God's creation is very much a part of the bread of life and the cup of the new covenant that we drink and eat each Sunday. And so our conversations evolved and changed and developed. And we realized that it wasn't just about saving green. It was about caring for God's creation. And so we started to look for ways that we could do that as a congregation. And one of the examples is we hold a monthly community dinner each month. Started working with our farmers market to buy local produce and incorporate that as part of our each month that we do that. We also have gone gleaning to various orchards here in town and take the fruit of the labors to local food shelters that are processed. And our latest one and probably biggest achievement is that we partnered with Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light and were able to get solar panels on our building through a program that they offered. And we're realizing 2020 has taught us a lot, and we're realizing that our call is changing. that we need to move into advocacy work. And we're trying to figure out what that looks like. So I'm anxious to hear from my colleagues for pointers and tips on this journey. But that's our kind of journey of transformation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those insights. And I love especially the example that you give of gleaning. You know, that is scriptural to leave the corners of the field, the edges of the field, so that people who are in need can get the harvest that is there. That is a wonderful testimony. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. McColl. Now, Kandi, if you would tell us a little bit about your transformative work.
So dosha maragoets, marishima ishuia hets. In my Herada language, I said, hello, relatives. My name is Eagle Woman. My English name is Kandi White, and I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network and have since 2007, but my work is more than that. You know, it's something I was born into. I grew up on what's known as the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation by the federal government, but it's the home of the Mandan, Hidatsa, Rikra nations. And growing up there, it was a very small world for me. I thought that the things that happened there on my reservation were how things happened in the entire world. And when I left, I quickly learned that that wasn't the case. When I went to college, I learned, for example, that people weren't experiencing the same things I was experiencing at a broad level in terms of sicknesses that we had at home, in terms of cancers and things of that nature. I also learned that people were spiritual in a different way. In our Native creation stories, it was just always very common sense to me that we are connected to the land. We belong to the land, that our bodies are physically made up of this, and therefore we have a, I guess, divine connection to the sacred. I also learned that some people didn't realize that. Some people were lost in that aspect. And what happened was I ended up getting cancer. So I'm a cancer survivor. I had a stage 4 sarcoma tumor when I was 20 years old and shouldn't technically be here for all intents and purposes from what the doctors had said. And so I really kicked it into high gear to find out what my calling was, I guess you'll say, which was use the voice that I have. Instead of always getting into trouble from, kindergarten all the way up through college, I was always very vocal and very outspoken, and it would get me into trouble at times. But now I use that. I use this gift that I have to speak to people about injustices that can happen to certain communities, and how, as Native people, myself being Native American woman, I can rely on my culture, my religion, my faith that way to help strengthen the work that I do, and to say that damage to the earth is damage to our souls. If we don't respect the land, we don't respect ourselves, therefore we don't respect creation. And that's a negative feedback loop that we are in now. So my hope is to transform from a negative feedback loop to a positive feedback loop, so that we're not cradle to the grave, but we're cradle to the cradle in everything we do. And I really loved what you had to say, Dr. McColl, because I started out on the Tribal Campus Climate Challenge, which was going to colleges and saying, hey, you can save money if you change your light bulbs, Hey, I know that you might not be that interested, but look at your energy bill. And that's a very good way to get a foot in the door and to get people started on their path. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you for sharing these powerful stories. I am so excited to hear, or to have incorporated into this, Indigenous spirituality as well. It's something that I think needs to be brought to the table more often when we're considering faith in climate or faith in climate activism. So I'm so grateful for your presence and your story, and I honor that. Thank you. Now, Reverend Mariama, would you share a little bit about your story?
Sure. So I am currently the pastor of New Roots, but I started off as a member of the ministerial staff at Bethlehem Church, a church that was actually founded in our dining room and then grew to be a congregation of about 500 now. But I remember watching the evolution of that congregation over my lifetime, from the time when I used to have to fold the bulletins on Saturday nights, and was a little resentful that was what I needed to do. I never thought I'd become a pastor, but here it is. God has other plans for you. And so when I think about the work that I do, the frame that I use is ecological justice. And that is not a rejection of climate justice or environmental justice. I don't really mind how people label the work I do, but the reason I use that frame is that eco means home. And ecology as a science looks at the relationships between things. It doesn't just sort of break things down into the cellular level or look at one piece. Ecology looks at the systems of relationships. And my understanding of the crisis that we're in is a crisis of relationship. We are not in right relationship with one another and with all of the other beings with whom we share this planet. That frame also makes the most sense for me because as a young woman who grew up in Boston in the 90s, I lived in the city that I love, but I also survived the real onset of drug addiction and the war on drugs and the way that it ravaged our communities, and the challenges when people can't find work, when school systems don't set young people up to be able to move in sustainable professions over the long run. And so I was a kid growing up in the neighborhood, and I went to a private school, and I remember hearing about the hole in the ozone layer, being blown away by that, but then also mobilizing and getting excited and going to the environmental club and being the only woman of color there. And over time, I've come to, at that point, I sort of said, well, let the middle class white folks work on this issue because, they don't have to deal with some of the other things that, my neighborhood is facing. And it's been a journey over time, particularly with living through Hurricane Katrina, seeing the real effects that climate change would have in exacerbating all the struggles our communities are already dealing with, and saying that it's never been a good idea for our communities to leave it to well-meaning white folks to make decisions about things that would impact our lives. And that shifted my frame about my need to be engaged. And, my own struggle with the church and how I finally decided to be so actively engaged. But the work that I've tried to do in engaging faith communities really does hit at the four core things. And I think they've already been named, but we sort of are explicit in. The first work is the work of theology, the work of naming that our relationship is God ordained. We cannot, it's not even an option to choose to be disconnected from our other relations. The scriptures say that God created us at the last point on the last day of creation. So who are we to say the whole 6.5 other days don't deserve any of the regard that we do? That way of thinking is bankrupt, and it has hurt us. It is also the same way of thinking that allowed my people to be enslaved. So really helping us to see the deep connections between bad theology and how it puts us in wrong relationship with one another, and what becomes possible when we choose to be in right relationship, how we can find healing and restoration and reconciliation with each other and with all of our relations. The second is really taking people out and connecting with the earth. This is particularly important for some of us who live in urban communities. There are ways in which people can think of the environment as something disconnected from them. But when you eat a tomato that you've grown yourself, you know there is something right about that the supermarket can never provide. And when you get to the top of the mountain, maybe you're huffing and puffing on your way up there, and you look out and you see the majesty, you cannot forget, you cannot feel disconnected. And we believe that people will fight for things that they love. And if we don't make sure that we can fall in love with all of our relations, that we can know them and connect with them, we're not going to successfully shift our attention and get into right relationship. The third being sustainable practices. We tend to introduce something at church and then give people the opportunity we try to lower the bar, make it very easy for them to then do the same thing at home. So if we're talking about changing the light bulbs in the church, we'll invite in those energy auditors to book people right there after church, sign up for your energy audit so that you can do what we've already done here. And finally, that fourth important point is advocacy. Maybe we'll have a little time to talk. We did a big solar project. In the middle of the solar project, our legislation changed, making the economics of the project more challenging. The size of the project shrunk. And we could have just focused on getting it done, but we used it as an opportunity to help people understand the importance of the way policy was being written and why it was harder for a lot of low-income communities and communities of color, and particularly a lot of urban communities, to have access to solar. And so we ended up helping. I started working on my first piece of legislation to shift that, and we've continued to stay engaged in that battle, because it's not enough just to ask people to take individualized action. That's important. It is part of the solution. But there are barriers for access, on food, on all sorts of green technology. And if we are not fighting to make sure everybody has equitable access, which means more access for the people who've been locked out in the past, then we really wouldn't be doing God's work of justice in the way we're called. So those are our pieces, and I look forward to digging more into the stories. I'm so excited to be here with sisters, and to be honest, it's so rare to be in a faith panel and to have all women. So I'm celebrating this moment, and I'm looking forward to being in dialogue.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. It is very powerful to think about the deep theology of the spirit, or a spirit, a creative energy connecting us to all of our relations beyond humanity, because we are not the only created beings. We may like to think so, but we are not. So I definitely appreciate all of your testimonies, all of your stories. I hold them and I hold space for them. And I'm so grateful to each of you for bringing them here to this space to share with us. So again, thank you for these powerful stories. I'd like to open up questions and discussions. So I'll start with a few questions, and we'll also take questions from the audience following that. So please continue to chat questions in the Action Center, and the team will provide them to me for the panel once I've asked the first few questions. So first, this is for all of you, how did you, or do you, use community partnerships to advance your work on climate change? Are there partnerships that you hope to form that could further your efforts?
I'll be glad to start, because I kind of touched on it. We got in partnership with Kentucky Interfaith Power and Light. And I know that several states have an organization of Interfaith Power and Light. And there's a national organization of Interfaith Power and Light. But on a local level, we started simple with the elementary school. The kids are already learning about Earth Day, and our ministerial colleagues here, Presbyterian Church has a community garden. And so we looked on local level, because I don't think, this is my humble opinion, this work can be overwhelming, and you cannot do it by yourself. And that's the whole point of communion and partnerships is working together. And that's how we come together to the end. And so we worked with our local elementary school. They were collecting bottle caps to try to recycle them into a bench. And they were overwhelmed with the amount of bottle caps. And so we worked with them to do that and helped place that. And started conversations with Presbyterian Church and they've created a garden up at the school that the kids go and they learn and plant. And so I think we have these partnerships, it's being aware, but I think you have to do it. And I think on the local level, for me, is where we start. And that may just because I'm a local pastor, but they're evident and there, if we just open our hearts and our minds, they're there. And we have partners willing to be in conversation with us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say thank you for this question, and thank you, Reverend Mariama, for everything you were saying, because I was just over here snapping my face, wanting to snap for you, because that's what it's all about, is community partnerships. It's about the people and all those that can't speak for themselves, all the wildlife, the plants, the animals, everything that's alive, the earth itself. That's why we say Mother Earth, is because she is alive, and sustains us as long as we sustain her. And so we go at a local level, a national level, international level, and all the way back down, using all the tools in the toolbox. But it always starts with those listening sessions, or just conversations, really. There's nothing like the power of visiting and just sitting with somebody and getting to know them and understand what it is that makes people happy, what it is that people want, because there's an assumption out there that in this whole climate crisis, that there's going to be this one size fits all blanket thing that we're going to be able to do for the world. And that's just not the case. Every single region is different. Every single community is different. So our partnerships, we are a network. We're not an organization. The Indigenous Environmental Network is comprised of grassroots groups that are predominantly, we see more and more, led by women. And I think it's just this whole idea of women being the givers of life. We are the first life for people. It's no coincidence that as women, we carry our babies in water. So we have this urgency within ourselves to protect that water. How do we do it together? Because as Dr. McColl said, there is no way that this could ever be done by anybody alone. We have to practice self-care. And that also is something that is part of this work, not just the projects that we do in the communities, but if somebody gets sick, if somebody has a child that has a problem, just having that sense of community and being there for each other. And I know this is kind of cliche, but it literally takes a village. Like, that is how we grew up. And it's so weird to me these days in the way that I explain my relationships, because at home, I can call my sisters and my brothers but people will say, isn't that your cousin? And I'm like, well, yeah, but Indian way. This is my sister, this is my brother, my sister, these are my moms. And they're like, you have more than one mom? And it's like, well, yeah. I mean, it's a closer, more tight-knit relationship system. And that's how people can not only survive, but thrive in the world, is by community, but also hearing each other, understanding each other, and being humble enough to speak when you should, but step back and listen when you should. And understand that there are different wants and needs. But I'm thinking of my garden. I'm so excited about the whole thing about growing tomatoes, because I do that every year. And then I make my own salsa, and I can my tomatoes, and I give those out as gifts to my family, to my friends, to my community. Instead of going into a store or buying a gift card or something, I make gifts. And a new thing is the gift of seeds, and saying, here, this is what you can do this year. You can invest in planting something. And if you're in a city, that's okay. Put something in your windowsill, put it in a pot, just little things that people can do no matter where they are.
Yeah, so that resonates so much. I remember, Kandi, to you, what you were saying is I remember one time I was TAing a class, and somebody said to me, how many aunts and uncles do you have? And I was like, oh, yeah. Anybody that was friends with my parents before a certain age, they just became aunts and uncles. So yeah, I don't know, like 50, 60, who knows? But yeah, this idea of being in partnership, I think, it just makes sense. And I do think, as you were saying, it does have a lot to do, I think, with I think women leaders have much more of a tendency to think of that as a default and to work from there. But I also think, part of the conversation we've had within our own congregation, so it's worth noting our congregation, we say we are reimagining what church can be. And most of our folks are folks who've left the Christian tradition because of homophobia, because of patriarchy, because of a lot of theological dynamics and systems of power and oppression that made it hard for them to stay. And so we are a place where many people are finding their way back to a tradition, because most of them will tell you they didn't have a problem with Jesus. It was just all the rest of the stuff around. And so, one of the things we've been really cognizant of is also as a church really paying attention about how we show up and how we think about power, because there's been so much damage done when the church has not thought about how to be in right relationship. It's always interesting to me that we have a story of a God who was willing, with all the power, to do something different, was willing to be broken on our behalf. And somehow we think that the right way to serve that God is to function from a place of bravado and power over. And for me, we live who Jesus was when we show up not needing to be the center of attention, not needing to say, oh, well, in order for you to do this, you have to meet these criteria that we've set up. We don't do any proselytizing or any of that. We try to ask, how can we be in right relationship with the rest of the folks in our community? And how can we not try to replicate what other people are doing well? How do we add on to it? So we do everything we do in our neighborhood, we do in partnership. We're always actually looking, how can we find where Spirit is already showing up and ally with the people who've already answered the call of the Spirit to work for justice. And so right now we're doing a lot of that work around food justice. We started off by just being part of COVID response in our neighborhood and buying tuna fish because that's what they said they needed, and it was hard to get donations of it. So I don't know how many cans of tuna fish I had in my car at different times, church members dropping it off. But I think the other piece is we have to show what it means to be in right relationship with, as Christians, to truly actually just support people without other layers and conditions, because I think that actually speaks to who we are called to be and how we can do that. So our one goal is we say that we try to bring a Jubilee flame to everything we show up at. And for us, that's the biblical tradition of Jubilee is that every 50 years, they would fully reset and people would be restored to their ancestral lands and captives would be set free and debts would be forgiven. And folks would start anew. And so our one goal is, we listen, we see what people really need, but we try to bring the notion that more is possible than what we are experiencing right now. That at any moment we could choose to be different. Spirit could break it open. And you don't have to know Spirit or call her the same way that we do, but Spirit could break it open to make more possible. And our hope is that the one thing we do is ask people not to settle for the status quo, to believe that if we work together, something else more beautiful and maybe even more powerful than we could imagine could manifest.
Absolutely. We do have about 14 minutes left, so I want to get to two very important questions. And if we have more time, we'll get to the audience questions. Audience questions will be sent out following the session, so don't worry. There are opportunities to have your questions answered following the session. So the next question I want to ask is, how would you challenge or encourage those in your communities who are afraid of stirring the pot, or people who think that climate or environmental action is very political and therefore are a little afraid to engage in it? How would you challenge or encourage those folks in your communities? Reverend Mariama, I know you mentioned people of color. We know our needs better than anyone else. So that is certainly a point that I'm thinking about, is there are people who are doing a lot of climate advocacy or doing a lot of environmental justice work, but more of people from our communities need to be engaged in that too. So I'm thinking those are the connections that I'm making. So, but this question is for all of you.
So I'll answer really quickly because I have a quick answer, which is I'm in the African Methodist Episcopal tradition. Being political is like not a thing that we are shy away from. Like we were the founders of our church were like part of the Underground Railroad. So like I sympathize with my clergy friends who can't say stuff and have to work. That is not a challenge in my tradition. The bigger thing is getting folks who have 7 other things that they think come before climate to see that this could be important. And the way that I think we need to do that is stop making climate and environmental issues disconnected from the economic and safety and other issues that people are dealing with. That doesn't even make any sense to me. If people need to eat, why can't we farm in sustainable ways? Why would we have something over here separate from the things that people are experiencing? So for my piece is, I want climate to be part of every other thing we're talking about, ecological justice to be at the heart of our economic policy, and not having these sort of separate issues that don't seem in alignment with some of the things that folks are already working on and struggling. So that's my quick answer.
Dr. McColl, did you want to go?
I was going to say, I think as the church, we did more damage not having those conversations, because people are looking at the church to be representatives of Jesus Christ and God's love here on earth. And the very relationship and connection is part of it. And if we are not becoming that voice for the voiceless, we're doing more damage. And the hypocrisy is that it's turning more people away from it. I mean, we've had people join our church because we were talking to a local paper that wanted to do an interview on our green initiatives. And we've had people say, I saw that, and I did not know churches were speaking out for the environment. I did not know churches cared about that, and I want to come be a part of it. And so I think we completely limit ourselves and go, we can't talk about that. And we're doing more damage to the church by avoiding the subject. And I agree that there are ways to do it, to create environments of conversation and dialogue and listen. But I think we, as the church, as people of faith, if we don't have the courage to follow the call that is given to us of being good stewards of God's creation, then nobody's going to listen to us anyway, because our words have no merit, our actions have no merit, and people are going to turn away faster than anything else.
I appreciate both of you and what you've said, because it is all about intersectionality. It's all about these connections in what we do. And it's also just about walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, getting to understand at that level where they're at, and taking the time to do that, and not making assumptions that I've had to learn that. I was able to go to schooling for environmental management. I was into this whole scientific realm as well, but not everybody is there. And this is very real for me. It hits home because where I'm from is right in the middle of an oil boom, Bakken oil development, and people prior to this have been struggling to put food on the table, struggling to pay health bills, struggling to take care of their parents. And so it's always this conundrum between poverty or signing a lease, and I have to listen to people when they say, sister, I love you, but, and then it's like, okay, let's, instead of but, do and or. What can we do that's different? Because it is political, unfortunately. And so having that grounding and that understanding to be big picture thinking enough that our egos as humans that we just inevitably have get checked. And we look at that big picture and what we can do on that level, and then also understanding what people can do at their level. So it's this whole tools in the toolbox thing that we keep coming back to, and providing options instead of just being told this is the way it is. We need the options that do exist.
Absolutely. There are things that constrict people. The exact example that you gave, I think about all the time in my communications with people who are in lower income communities, is I can't buy organic produce, or I can't buy locally grown food because it's so expensive. I have bills to pay. So it's easier for me to get my kids McDonald's because it's right there and it's cheap than going to the local grocery store and getting a bunch of organic produce. So that's one example, and I appreciate that you bring that up. It is absolutely intersectional. Then next question is, what do you do to ground yourself in this work, to stay resilient in the face of the magnitude of climate change and the injustices that are at its root? Are there certain practices that you do that you would recommend to the audience? I will note, this is a very selfish question on my part because I'm about to embark on a PhD in sustainability, and I'm going to need some grounding methods for when I am diving into the intense tasks of faith leadership, research, writing, community activism, like all of those things is going to be very draining. So are there things that you would recommend to ground yourself that you practice?
I'm going to answer this really quickly. Reaffirm your connection with the sacred. That sounds very intimidating, but literally I go outside without my socks and shoes on and stand on the earth or lay on the ground. This could be difficult for some people in cities, find a patch of grass maybe, but not being in your air-conditioned, climate-controlled home, in your climate-controlled car, in your climate-controlled office. We have so much in the way of our reconnection that we have to step outside of that and be out in what we are made up of, nature, and not forget to look up if you can see the stars, and not forget to breathe the air, and understand that the most important resources we have are air, water, and soil. Those are the three resources we need to protect, and your self-care is important for sustainability. So again, check the ego. You can't do it all. It's not about what you did in your lifetime. It's about that ripple effect that it's going to have for the next 7 generations and how you made an impact when you were here.
I would just echo that of using the language of Sabbath. We did a Sabbath study with our congregation, and it was such a concept. It was such a foreign concept of, that we hear about the ministers taking days off, but our people who work 9 to 5 don't get that. On Sundays and Saturdays are filled with other stuff. And so we tried to break the framework or traditional framework of Sabbath, that of just it's the getting out and separating yourself. It's taking that step out for a moment so you're just get a glimpse of something different. And in that conversation of Sabbath, we talked about how we're called to let the land have Sabbath and to regrowth. And if God is saying that for the land, that is for you as well. And so we intentionally practice still Sabbath in our church. In the month of July, our 7th month, we do not do meetings. And people, at first it was like, oh my gosh, how we do this? We can't function. And now it's like, we're still doing Sabbath in July, right? And I was like, yes, because it's that break away from your grind, and it gives you that opportunity to step back and get reconnected to creation and to our people, our relationships, our family. And it's not taking a vacation. It is that Sabbath moment of finding God's grace and stilling the voices so you can listen and find that center light, God's light in you again. And that's one that I cannot say I practice well, but I try to do better at.
Well, I concur with both of you that those are both things that I agree with. I have been taking Friday at noon to Saturday at noon. That's going to be a lot harder in this new role because I started yesterday and I've already gotten like emails about everything that people need me to address in the whole city. And I'm, so anyway, but I think that one of the things I would say is you need to have an accessible daily practice. So I do spend 1 day a month in complete silence. Love it. It is so restorative. And you need something that you can do every day. You can do in a pinch that you can 5 minutes. Maybe it's a mantra that you hold on to, 5 minutes of meditation, a time of prayer. One of the things I love, I'm an early riser. I like to light my candle, and I make my own candles. So I like to light them as the sun is rising and welcome the dawn. Sometimes I do yoga so that I can literally do sun salutation. But you, every day, you need to reset. You need to reground yourself in who you are called to be, and what matters. Because you will be bombarded left and right by people trying to sell you stuff, people trying to get you to align with whatever they're doing. And if you don't have a true north to hold on to, and you don't have a way of connecting with that true north every day, I usually say have a practice that's so easy that if something goes wrong in the middle of the day, you can say, excuse me, I got to run to the bathroom. Get yourself in that stall and do what you need to do to pull it back in and refocus. I think the biggest challenge for humans is living and letting the days pass by without being centered on our deeper purpose. It is so easy to lose track of it and just keep doing stuff, and making sure that every day, and your sense of deeper purpose will evolve. It's okay, you don't know it all now, but make sure every day you give time to say, Spirit, remind me who I am and what I'm called to be and do in this moment. And what I'm called to be is as important, if not more important, than what I'm called to do. The obsession with what we are doing, half the reason we're in this ecological challenge is we're doing too much. Sit down, take some Sabbath, and figure out who you're called to be. And often when you know who you're called to be, you'll stop doing quite so much and put your focus on the things that really matter.
How powerful. Thank you. I'm so inspired by all of you, and I'm so grateful. Unfortunately, I wish this conversation could go on forever, but we do need to close. Thank you so much to our speakers for sharing their stories, their insights, and encouragement and witness today. We are so grateful for your leadership, and we know that we have more to do to reach our goals of a healthy, sustainable, and just world for our communities, for ourselves, for our children. Let's head back to Annie to continue this discussion. Again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.